After the Army of Northern Virginia delivered another major victory at Second Manassas, Lee seized on the strategic initiative by moving across the Potomac River and taking the war to the loyal North. Lee wasted very little time after Second Manassas in preparing to go into Maryland, and his decision was shaped by several factors. First, he put his faith in the offensive as the best chance to achieve a victory of annihilation over Union armies. He also sought logistical relief for the Confederate home front, given that Northern and Central Virginia had been occupied by armies with voracious appetites for food and fodder. Both sides had dismantled fences for campfires and fortifications, confiscated livestock, trampled crops, and drunk the wells dry. Heading north might also fill his empty ranks with new recruits. Maryland had many Southern sympathizers, mostly in Eastern Maryland, but Lee's army was headed into Unionist-dominated Western Maryland. His soldiers were bitterly disappointed when Marylanders did not greet them as liberators. Politics likewise motivated Lee. If he could win a decisive victory on Northern soil, perhaps it would influence the fall congressional elections in the North. Democrats might well take control of Congress, which could possibly lead to an armistice and a peace settlement. Finally, Lee thought that battlefield success might gain foreign support for the Confederacy, especially from Great Britain and France. Given these factors, on September 4, 1862, only 5 days after the victory at Second Manassas, the Army of Northern Virginia crossed the Potomac at White's Ford into Maryland and headed toward Frederick. There, Lee decided on the course of his action. He needed to run his supply line back into Virginia's Shenandoah Valley, but the enemy's occupation of Harper's Ferry stood in the way. Lee decided to divide his forces, dispatching Jackson with more than half the army to capture the 12,000-man Union garrison at Harper's Ferry. The remainder of the Confederate army would move deeper into Maryland toward Hagerstown. Dividing his smaller army before the Army of the Potomac was extraordinarily risky, even with McClellan as the opponent. Lee's plan, issued as Special Orders 191, was put into operation, and all the Confederates marched away from Frederick in different directions. But the campaign quickly began to unravel. First, the army suffered miserably from large-scale straggling and desertion. Some of the men had not signed up to fight on Northern soil and refused to cross the Potomac. Others had busted shoes, threadbare uniforms, and empty haversacks. The active campaigning since August had taken a toll. Food was also scarce, and soldiers were largely living on green apples and green corn. Chronic diarrhea ripped through the ranks. Approximately 65,000 Confederates had crossed the Potomac, but by Lee's own estimates, a third to half of his army fell out of the ranks during the campaign. This was an enormous rate of attrition. Lee's concerns grew when he realized that McClellan was moving with uncharacteristic speed. The Union general's confidence received a boost when some Indiana soldiers, kicking through the debris left in an abandoned Confederate camp, discovered some papers wrapped around 3 cigars. The papers were an extra set of the orders that had been sent to General D.H. Hill. Holding up the plans, McClellan announced, "Here is a piece of paper with which, if I cannot whip Bobby Lee, I will be willing to go home." McClellan pressed his 102,000-man army to the west, and his troops seized control of the gaps in South Mountain on September 14th. A day later, Harper's Ferry fell to Jackson, and Lee decided to concentrate his army on the high ground overlooking Antietam Creek near Sharpsburg. By the morning of the 17th, Lee had between 30,000 and 35,000 troops in place, leaving one division under A.P. Hill back in Harper's Ferry. McClellan, however, turned cautious after South Mountain. Instead of striking Lee's scattered forces, he inched his army toward Sharpsburg on the 15th, and the next day he moved some troops across Antietam Creek at dusk. With the first morning light on September 17th, McClellan's men would initiate the bloodiest day in the American Civil War.
So, Carrie, we've established that Lee's army was depleted in its march through Northern Virginia, across the Potomac and into Maryland. But with those fewer numbers, Lee, he always had an eye for terrain. Could you describe for us the ground that he held by Antietam Creek on the morning of September 17th?
Absolutely. So Lee is west of Antietam Creek. He's occupying the high ground along Hagerstown Pike. His army is spread out for about 2.5 miles. The left is anchored on a ridge near Nicodemus Farm, and then it will pass through a cornfield belonging to David R. Miller. And then that part of the line will be anchored along a plateau where you can today go visit the Dunker Church, a prominent white church on the battlefield.
A church of pacifists, we should add.
A church of pacifists, which is incredibly, perhaps ironic, considering this horrific battle that's going to take place there. Then the rest of his line proceeding to the south, part of it, the center of the line will be anchored along a sunken road. It's an old farm lane that had been used so much that it had fallen below grade in many places. It was running east-west. And then the far right will be farther down to the south near a bridge that will become known as Burnside's Bridge. So McClellan is back in command. He's always been in command of the Army of the Potomac, but now he has this full force with him again. What is his plan at Antietam?
Historians have a very difficult time discerning what he intended to do on the morning of September 17th. But I think everyone is in agreement that McClellan always worked from an assumption, and that assumption is that he was always badly outnumbered. He thought that Lee's army was maybe in the range of 100,000 men. I mean, certainly, Lee didn't have more than 50,000, maybe 45,000. But that was never McClellan's working assumption. And so every decision that he made prior to the battle and during the battle is that fear that he is outnumbered. Now, he did intend to strike the Confederate left flank. That left flank anchored in the area of the Dunker Church, which you just described. That opening assault was led by Joseph Hooker. Joseph Hooker was a man who was extraordinarily aggressive. He's also a man who was very ambitious politically, but he knew how to deliver an assault. The attack I'm about to describe, the very first assault, and one in which you can in fact stand at the edge of the North Woods. The Park Service has done a brilliant job of restoring the three main woodlots on the Confederate left flank. The North Woods, that's the jumping off point for Hooker's attack. There's the East Woods, and then there's the West Woods. You can stand at the North Woods today. You can follow the route of Hooker's men. And the details here are important. I believe they're important because they help us understand why Civil War assaults often unraveled. And they unraveled not because generals were incompetent, it's just called the fog of war. So there are 3 brigades that Hooker had under his command to make that opening assault. Those 3 brigades together, probably in the range of 6,000 men. The idea is they advanced toward that Dunker Church and they hit the Confederate line with one concentrated blow. When the assault began, of those 3 brigades, only one made it to strike the Confederates. The other 2, one commanded by an officer named Christian, he became unnerved by the artillery fire. He walked away from his command. A second officer named Hartsuff was hit by a shell fragment. He's wounded. The command obviously halted. The 3rd Brigade, Duryier's brigade, is the only one that made it through the famous cornfield. The initial fighting didn't happen in the cornfield. It happened on the edge of the cornfield, and they ran, Duryier's men, smack into a Confederate line. That initiated a series of attacks back and forth. The fighting's extraordinarily fluid, and you gotta go to the field, you gotta walk that ground, and you'll come to appreciate why the fighting was so savage and why the casualties were so intense. There is no need for us to go over all those movements. I think what people need to imagine again is that one side has an upper hand, and just when they're about to deliver that knockout blow, reinforcements arrive on the other side, and it goes back and forth and back and forth. It's about 9 o'clock when the fighting ended on that part of the Confederate left flank, and the casualties, total casualties, about 8,000 men, just in that short period of time in that first phase of fighting.